bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Gravediggers.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
This is Erin.
This is Monsieur Mohamed Amer.
Ooh. And welcome back to Das Criminal podcast, or welcome for the first time if you're a first-timer.
Yeah, we always welcome first-timers as well. This isn't just a closed clique.
And you picked a good week because we've got a real good one for you. This has everything we love in a podcast. CIA conspiracies, drugs.
If you are listening, please take the package of tinfoil that has been mailed to you and wrap it around your head tightly so the government doesn't monitor your brainwaves.
We do want to put a warning out here. In this episode, we discuss drugs and possible suicide. So if you feel suicidal and need to talk, we will put a list of suicide crisis lines in the episode description. The year is 1953, and the Cold War is heating up fast. The United States has stoked proxy wars worldwide, supporting anti-communist forces in places like Kenya, Korea, Malaysia, Paraguay, and Vietnam. On February 23rd, you open the New York Times to see a special report about a broadcast on Peiping radio. At that time, Peiping and Peking were the more common romanizations of Beijing, the capital of the People's Republic of China. The article reads, quote, "Red germ charges cite 2 U.S. Marines." A Chinese communist propaganda broadcast today quoted 2 captured Marine Corps air officers as saying the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff had directed the United States forces in the Far East to carry out planned germ warfare, end quote. The U.S. Department of Defense unit occupying Japan and Korea, known as the Far East Command, denies wielding such weapons. But respected scholars like Canadian researchers Endicott and Hagerman have compiled evidence to suggest the United States likely used biological agents in the Korean War. Fast forward to July of that same year. The United Nations, North Korea, and China signed the Korean Armistice Agreement, commencing Operation Big Switch to repatriate prisoners of war. 21 American soldiers refused to come home and defect, mainly to China, though many eventually returned to the United States. Still, the United States treats all the returning POWs as potential security risks. Debriefings become combative as U.S. intelligence tries to suss out dormant traitors. The CIA argues the need for something that can elicit confessions from possible communist spies, a truth serum. It's now November of that same year. An American scientist named Frank Olson returns from a work retreat at a former Boy Scout camp and tells his wife, Alice, that he's made a terrible mistake. He tries to resign from his job, but something changes his mind. The following weekend, Frank Olson plummets out a 13-story window at the Hotel Statler in New York. The night manager scrambles out to the sidewalk to try and help. Olson, still clinging to life, tried to raise his head and say something to the manager. But before he could make this last confession, Frank Olson died. When the NYPD arrives in room 1018A, Olson's room, they encounter his colleague and roommate, Robert Lashbrook, sitting on the toilet. Something about that night haunts the hotel manager. The details just don't add up. He later reflects, quote, "In all my years in the hotel business, I never encountered a case where someone got up in the middle of the night, ran across a dark room in his underwear, avoiding 2 beds, and dove through a closed window with the shade and curtains drawn," end quote. The string that ties these events together winds around a dark series of events in American history, Project MKUltra. From 1953 to 1967, the CIA conducted a series of experiments on human subjects to develop, in the words of Naomi Klein, quote, "a scientifically based system for extracting information from resistant sources. In other words, torture," end quote. One such human subject was biochemist Frank Olson. Without his prior knowledge, Olson was dosed with LSD at the November 1953 work retreat by his colleague and the head of the MKUltra program, Sidney Gottlieb. Only 9 days later, in the early hours of the morning, Frank Olson would die on the sidewalk in front of the Statler Hotel. What did happen to Frank Olson? Did he fall out of the window in the middle of the night? Did he have some sort of nervous breakdown and leap to his death? Or is it possible that Frank Olson was pushed?
On the subject of this current CIA video that I'm sure everyone has seen, Humans of CIA is what it's called, I'm pretty sure the lady in the video walks down a hall with various oil paintings of various CIA figures, one of which I'm pretty sure is Sidney Gottlieb.
He was a pretty significant character, and he headed up this very large and well-financed program.
Yeah, I mean, he's not a nobody. I mean, we'll get into him later, but it's just so funny to me that the CIA published a video that's meant to be like woke, and this lady is talking about like anxiety and like imposter syndrome, walking past a guy who's known for like putting industrial amounts of acid into homeless people to, I guess, reveal truths and brainwash them.
Yeah, the whole story is just bone-chilling. So, we've included our sources for this episode in our master list, like always, but I want to acknowledge 2 pieces of media that you might want to check out if you're looking for more about this case. The first is Stephen Kinzer's book, Poisoner-in-Chief Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. We also referenced Kinzer's book, All the Shah's Men, in our episode on the coup against Mossadegh in Iran. Kinzer's book on Sidney Gottlieb and MKUltra includes a chapter specifically on Frank Olson. The next reference is Errol Morris's documentary drama Wormwood. It's available on Netflix. The 6-part series definitely takes some creative liberties during its scene recreations, considering that Frank Olson is no longer alive to tell us his side of the story. We'll do our best to indicate when a piece of information is a definite fact versus a stylized tidbit in the documentary. Wormwood also features interviews with Frank Olson's son, Eric. He has been a driving force in seeking answers in his father's death. There are many thought-provoking moments in those interviews we just couldn't include in the episode because of time purposes, so if you're interested in hearing him speak directly, would definitely recommend watching that. The reenactment portion of the docuseries plays out several permutations of what could have happened, focusing on Eric's theories, so we're going to discuss these in more detail later. So let's begin with a little bit of background on Frank Olson. Other than the whole secret biochemical weapons program thing, Frank Olson seems to have been a pretty regular guy. Born to Swedish immigrants in 1910, Frank grew up in Hurley, Wisconsin. He attended the University of Wisconsin, first earning his Bachelor of Science and then his PhD in bacteriology. He married a woman named Alice, and they had 3 children, Eric, Nils, and Lisa. Eric in particular has spent decades searching for answers about his father's death. Facing a mountain of student loan debt even back then, Frank enrolled in the Reserve Officers Training Corps and was quickly called to active duty when the United States entered the Second World War. In 1942, his former thesis advisor, Ira Baldwin, snagged Olson to join him at the secret newly built biological warfare laboratories at Camp Detrick in Maryland. Though he formally left the Army in 1944, Frank Olson continued his work at Camp Detrick on a civilian contract. As the war ended, the United States brought former Nazi scientists to the laboratory under Operation Paperclip.
Yeah, so keep that in mind the next time the US tries to justify intervention by comparing some government or another, whether it's Assad or North Korea or whatever, to Nazi Germany, because if they really were Nazis, the US would be actively smuggling them in instead of fighting them.
Olson would have worked with these scientists, many of them essentially fugitives from war crimes indictments. Some speculate that if Olson was killed for knowing too much, Operation Paperclip may have been part of that illicit information. Frank Olson specialized in aerosol delivery systems, technology designed to spray pathogens or toxins over enemies.
Yeah, so there's a big debate in the scientific community over what constitutes an aerosol versus a droplet. And I'm sure those are terms you've seen often with the whole COVID pandemic. But the biggest determining factor in whether something is an aerosol or a droplet is size. So there have been conflicting limits or demarcations on where one begins and one ends. So the diameter could be 2 micrometers, 5 micrometers, 10 micrometers, 20 micrometers, or some papers have even gone as far as saying as 100 micrometers, where anything smaller is an aerosol and anything bigger is a droplet. But that's the fundamental difference, is that droplets are larger and therefore tend to sink to the ground, whereas aerosols would remain suspended in the air. And, we've had this issue early in the COVID pandemic where people weren't sure whether COVID was transmitted by aerosols or droplets, because if it's aerosols, then it would be a lot more dangerous in terms of you could walk next to someone who has COVID, and because they would expel the pathogen in the air and you breathe the same air, you could be infected. Whereas with droplets, it's a lot less dangerous, because if you walk past someone who's coughed in a specific area or whatever, the droplets would eventually sink to the ground and the virus dies. From the research I've seen, COVID is a droplet transmission, so which is why you have things like staying 6 feet away from people and so on. That being said, aerosol weapons in terms of like military technology are quite useful, because not only can you like air spray them from a plane over an enemy, you can also install them in a building's ventilation and then, trigger them, and the ventilation just does the rest, and you can kill an entire building full of people that way.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, studying this stuff as part of my degree was quite disturbing, because it shows how much of education in general is basically people paying people to figure out how to kill other people.
Yeah, and how people manage to separate ethics from science and think to themselves like, oh, well, I'm just developing this new technology. I'm not making policy, or I'm not using it. And like, I don't think that's really a good excuse.
Oh yeah, I know a couple of people from my program who like I'm not like close friends with, but I'm like, acquaintances with, work in like research labs that they're not the Pentagon, but they're Pentagon adjacent. So like they get their funding from the Pentagon, and the guys must have like some set level of clearance and stuff. And the projects are supposed to be like scientifically neutral. They're not weapons per se, but they're things like, I know one of them is working on something that's like healing in the battlefield. And I'm pretty sure the healing is for American troops and not like, Afghan peasants or whatever.
Mm-hmm. The United States feared the Soviets were developing similar devices, so the government poured resources into covert biological warfare projects. The Germans and the Japanese also experimented with biochemical weapons during World War II. German scientists tortured human subjects in the concentration camps. Joseph Mengele is the most infamous example of such a grim reaper. Similarly, but less well known in the West, the Japanese Unit 731 did horrific experiments on Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, and Russian prisoners. I do not recommend looking these up. I only started reading the Wikipedia page and I had to stop. It's so horrific. Like the Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip, several leaders of the Japanese Unit 731 were exempted from war crimes prosecution before being employed by the United States. The Soviet Khabarovsk war crime trials documented human experimentation at Unit 731, but the US government dismissed this as propaganda. However, we now know that these allegations were true. The Japanese did conduct experiments on human subjects during World War II.
As an aside, fun fact, the United States space program was founded on, Nazi scientists being exfiltrated. The entire space program was built around the design for the Nazi V-2 rocket. So unlike the Soviets, who basically researched everything themselves, the Americans built their entire space program around a Nazi ballistic missile.
My great-grandfather was part of the battalion that captured the V-2 rocket factory. Fun fact.
Ooh, that's a very fun fact.
But I'm sure he didn't know about Operation Paperclip because his family was killed in the concentration camps. He would not be fucking happy about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of soldiers were thinking they were doing the right thing, and then some, awful-looking guy from, military intelligence, back then it was called the OSS, would show up and be like, I need to talk to these Nazi prisoners, and they just disappear.
Well, according to Kinzer's book, they would basically walk around the town with clipboards, list of people's names, and if they found so-and-so and that person was highlighted in a certain color or something, it meant scoop them up for biochemical warfare or rocket research or something of the sort.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it also included giving these people fake identities and stuff. So the higher echelons of the US intelligence facilitated this entire process, including giving them new lives, basically. It wasn't just oh, this is a prisoner, we'll take them in. It's just hey, you get to have a new home, a car, live a new life, just work for us. Right.
But these people had to have known, as in the other scientists, because if suddenly your job hires like 5 new people and they're all from Germany with German accents. Like,
Yeah, my name is John, yeah. I do the American baseball, yeah. I like apple pie, yeah.
yeah, so it sounds like Frank Olson might have been aware of this and also irritated by it, but we can't know for sure.
Yeah.
As acting chief of the Special Operations Division, a unit with close ties to the CIA, Frank Olson was often at the forefront of research and development for this technology. According to Kinzer, Olson also created small aerosol containers that could spray deadly agents like anthrax. In June of 1950, the United States officially entered the Korean War, supporting South Korea against North Korea and its allies, the Soviet Union and China. As early as the following year, China and North Korea alleged that the United States was engaging in biological warfare. In 1952, after various outbreaks of smallpox, cholera, meningitis, and the bubonic plague on the Korean peninsula, China and North Korea renewed these claims. The United States rejected the accusations of biological warfare as red propaganda. But in February of 1953, China and North Korea aired confessions by captured United States Marine Corps pilots, stating that they had, in fact, dropped biological weapons over Korea. Upon release, these soldiers recanted their confessions and claimed they had only made the original statements under torture. Keep in mind, however, that POWs who reveal state secrets can be charged with treason.
Yeah, and treason, I'm pretty sure, at the time at least, was a capital crime.
The US government repudiated the biological warfare allegations as a hoax. Still, to this day, journalists and historians maintain that such weapons were likely used, or at least that the claim cannot be dismissed. Biological weapons offer some degree of deniability due to their covertness. A country like the United States can claim whatever disease outbreaks occur in China and Korea are simply natural phenomena, nothing to do with them or the war. Such plausible deniability becomes crucial in the context of the Cold War. Powers want to save their reputation of being the good guys on the global stage, and infecting civilians with cholera doesn't help that image.
Yeah, also the other aspect is that biological weapons have a multiplier effect. So unlike, say, traditional bombs where you have to fly over and bomb a specific location to kill specific people, with biological agents, you can just drop your aerosolizing canister and infect a population, and that population walks around, moves around, etc., etc. And that disease, whether it's anthrax or cholera, will spread rapidly and basically decimate large swathes of both, military and civilian personnel that you're fighting against.
Right, well, disease obviously doesn't discriminate between a soldier and a civilian.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
By 1953, Frank Olson had become convinced that the United States did, in fact, use biological weapons during the Korean War. Alice Olson, Frank's wife, remembers that he was, quote, always very upset about Korea, end quote. Family friend Norman Kernoyer also recalls that Frank Olson was sure that the US had used biological weapons in Korea and was very angry about this crime. Kernoyer also later told Frank's son, Eric, that Frank saw people tortured to death in interrogations during trips to Europe as part of Project Artichoke, the precursor to MKUltra, in which Frank Olson was involved.
Okay, this is horrific, but also, what a dumb fucking name. Like, imagine naming a top secret project after a vegetable that isn't even particularly tasty.
Okay, but have you ever put salt and honey on an artichoke?
No, should I?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try that and then reevaluate my position on naming a top secret military project over artichoke.
Oh, they're all terrible names. Operation Paperclip,
Yeah, just fucking nerds.
British journalist Gordon Thomas also learned through his friend, William Sargent, that Frank Olson had witnessed human subjects die in experiments and felt greatly disturbed by this. After Olson confided in Sargent, Sargent reported him to British intelligence as a security risk. Now, in my opinion, as a biological weapons specialist, Olson would know which technology the Army had developed and therefore recognize whether the reports from China and Korea matched these designs. For instance, if Olson had tested a diffusion device for, say, smallpox in the lab at Fort Detrick, and then hears reports from China that such a device spread smallpox in Korea, this would be strong evidence that the United States had used those biological weapons. Additionally, due to Frank Olson's position as a scientist at Camp Detrick, it would have been difficult for the government to discredit him if he came forward saying he believed the US had used biological weapons in Korea. Meanwhile, some soldiers defected after the war, and more still came back disillusioned with the American project. Americans assumed that these defectors had been broken somehow, rather than consider that they left or became sour due to their own ideological reasons. In other words, they didn't want to believe that US soldiers could become resentful of the government and decide to criticize it or leave. Similarly, the US government and media insisted that the captured pilots must have been brainwashed by China to confess to using biochemical weapons. Interestingly, the term brainwashing was first used in English by journalist Edward Hunter in 1950 to explain why some POWs complied with their captors' demands. This is a much easier explanation than admitting to war crimes. Additionally, it persuades the American public that communists are some sort of anencephalous hive rather than a group of people acting on sincere principles.
Yeah, and I also think this taps into deeper anxieties that generally plague any given military, which is the fear of the collapse of unit cohesion. So whether it's old-fashioned desertion or, modern-day defecting to live in Beijing, commanders seem incapable of recognizing that people, generally speaking, don't like being killed, and they, generally speaking, don't like killing other people for the most part. And so, the psychological toll of war can and does break people. But no, for these commanders, it's like the devious threads have hypnosis techniques.
Yeah. If something like brainwashing did exist, then the United States government wanted to be at the forefront of developing it as a scientific practice. Specifically, they wanted to be able to break a prisoner, to force them to confess their secrets and even reassemble them into a type of robot spy.
Yeah, there's a lot of fiction about so-called Manchurian candidates, and I've played a lot of video games around this plot or movies and stuff. And basically, it's the idea that you can, if you inject some substance into someone or put them through some sort of procedure, then they can, become a sleeper agent in the sense that they're normal people and do normal things until you can, quote unquote, switch them on by a sequence of code words. And then they become like, secret agent spies that are like slaves to your commands.
On the one hand, I think this sounds so ridiculous. And the fact that the US government was pouring resources into this is like, what the fuck is happening with that? But on the other hand, people do become psychologically very disturbed, like people who are in cults or who are kidnapped and then eventually bond with their captors and these other things. Like, it's not totally unreasonable to think that you can fuck with someone psychologically. Like, of course you can. It's called torture. But it's just sick to try and want to, like, develop that.
Yeah, wasn't there a case of that lady who was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Front in America?
Patty Hearst.
That's the one. That's the name. I was like, what's the name of the lady? Yeah, and then she became like a member of the group.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, you're right. Like the response to that should be no one should do it, not we should do it better.
Right. So psychologists considered that confusing someone might be an excellent way to break them. Drugs, of course, cause impairment that could bring about such confusion. Those of us who have consumed alcohol or been near people who have know that drunk people are more likely to spill their secrets, or drunk Erin is, at least. She is notorious for it.
I will neither confirm nor deny on whether I do that.
Allen Dulles, in particular, the head of the CIA from 1953 until 1961, who oversaw coups and massacres in Iran, Guatemala, Paraguay, the Dominican Republic, Indonesia, Congo, Laos, and Vietnam, just to name a few places, reportedly pushed very hard for research into drugs as an interrogation and brainwashing tool.
Okay, that CIA video with the intersectional anxiety lady, definitely I saw Allen Dulles in the background, like a painting of Allen Dulles, an oil painting.
He is a sicko.
Oh, yeah, I mean, look, if you have a globe at home, like a physical globe, which I don't know if the kids these days know what that is, but if you have a globe, just spin it and throw a dart, and chances are it will land on a country that Allen Dulles fucked with.
This brings us to Project MKUltra. The conspiracy theory-minded among you probably already know a good deal about this, but we'll summarize just in case. Project MKUltra was a secret program planned and carried out by the CIA to experiment on human subjects with drugs. From 1953 to 1973, the CIA, in partnership with the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories at Camp Detrick, wanted to determine if substances like LSD could coerce confessions out of captives. Under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb, CIA agents used American and Canadian citizens as unwitting test subjects, experimenting with administering drugs and other chemicals, electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and other forms of torture.
Keep in mind, a lot of the victims were also homeless and transient people who were much more vulnerable to this, and their disappearance would not raise a lot of questions. As an aside, a big site of MKUltra and MKUltra, or MKUltra being MKUltra experiments, was the University of McGill in Montreal. So just another case of how Canada, since the Cold War, really, since World War II, is pretty much a glorified 51st state in its following the US in all foreign policy.
As a biochemist at Camp Detrick, Frank Olson worked closely with Sidney Gottlieb and the other CIA agents pioneering Project MKUltra. From Wednesday, November 18th to Friday, November 20th, 1953, Frank Olson joined colleagues from Camp Detrick and the CIA for a retreat at a cabin on Deep Creek Lake in Maryland. Gottlieb ran these retreats every few months to get the scientists away from laboratories and into a more creative mindset. Olson's boss, Colonel Vin Rouet, was also at the retreat. Keep Vin Rouet in mind because he pops up frequently in this story. On Thursday evening, Robert Lashbrook, Gottlieb's deputy, brought out a bottle of Cointreau and poured glasses for the researchers. The men drank. Gottlieb then revealed to the cohort that they had been drugged with LSD. A government inquiry would later suggest that Olson had knowingly ingested the LSD as part of an experiment, but I think he was unaware until Gottlieb told the group. In the early 1950s, LSD was a newly discovered substance, and its side effects weren't widely known. I don't see a 43-year-old married father of 3 with a PhD in biochemistry volunteering to take an experimental drug. Furthermore, simply giving someone drugs and seeing how they react isn't an experiment. A scientific experiment has a control, like giving a mouse a task to complete when it's sober and then seeing how it performs the same task after taking a drug. Olson would have understood this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, listen, if I went to my supervisor in undergrad for my undergrad dissertation and told him that I basically just dosed a bunch of people with acid to observe the results, that's not an experiment. I would have been not only failed, but laughed at the university.
Yeah, and hopefully arrested.
I mean, yeah, in addition to the whole, it being a crime part. I mean, this also applies to the Nazi scientists in Unit 731. I've seen a lot of people who are ostensibly, quote unquote, not Nazis, but are like, well, these people had valuable scientific research. No, it wasn't scientific research. Their experiments were basically torturing prisoners and figuring out creative ways to kill people, to inflict pain and to cause death, because a genuine scientific experiment would have something like a control group, and it would have a hypothesis, and it would test that hypothesis to establish correlative or causal relationship between dependent and independent variable, and not just, torture prisoners or, cut off twins or whatever Mengele did, or, those people with acid or whatever.
Vin Rouet also describes being unknowingly drugged, and I don't see why he would lie. Pretty much every other source I found, including Kinzer's book and articles about the case in mainstream media outlets like the New York Times, say that Olson was unwittingly given LSD, so I think we can assume he didn't know. Being drugged with LSD, or with any drug without your knowledge, must be so frightening. I'd imagine you'd begin hallucinating and genuinely think that you're losing your mind. Drugging any person with any substance without their knowledge is a sick and twisted thing to do. Sidney Gottlieb sounds like a real freak to me. This fits with Gottlieb's profile. In 1961, he designed poison to assassinate Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected leader of the DRC. That plot failed, but the Americans would eventually be part of a different assassination of Lumumba. Gottlieb also designed several failed plans to assassinate Castro. It seems like the CIA held this guy on some sort of pedestal, funneling him more and more resources, which is bizarre considering that none of his harebrained schemes ever seem to have worked.
After leaving the CIA, Gottlieb went on to found a company called Acme Inc., where he sold various mallets, anvils, pies, TNT, dynamite, and other weaponry to anthropomorphic animals and Elmer Fudd.
Meep, meep. Eric thinks that at the point of the retreat, his father was already targeted by the CIA due to his opposition to what he believed was the use of biological weapons in Korea, and possible objections to Project MKUltra and similar endeavors as well. Perhaps Gottlieb wanted to root out any agents who might be possible defectors or whistleblowers, and decided to give his new experimental interrogation drug, LSD, a try. Maybe he had his eye on Frank Olson from the beginning. Let's also remember 1953 was at the height of McCarthyism, accusing others of being communists or traitors. It's not unreasonable to assume that Gottlieb would want to suss out potential dissidents within his own program. I also wonder if this was a possible vanity project by Gottlieb and the CIA at the beginning of Project MKUltra, like they were trying to prove that they could suss out a potential traitor even within their own ranks. Whatever happened at that retreat, it didn't go over well with Frank Olson. Alice remembers that her husband was upset when he came home, and that his behavior was very unusual. Though he was clearly bothered by something, she says Frank didn't show any signs of being suicidal.
As someone who has studied neuroscience, also as someone who has partaken in various recreational drugs, I can confirm that a come down period following a drug high can be really devastating and very distressing. When I took acid, the crash after that was pretty rough, but it was more physically rough, like just being physically tired and wanting to lie down. Whereas MDMA had the most psychological exhaustion in terms of, feeling incredibly fried and depressed, which, that's exactly what it does. It basically lights up your brain like a Christmas tree and then fries it. So depending on the amount of acid given, Olson's come down could have been very, very disturbing, to say the least.
Frank told Alice that his colleagues had laughed at him and that he, quote, made a terrible mistake, end quote. Could this mistake have been indicating to his colleagues that he held some moral opposition to the activities of the Army and the CIA? Eric remembers his father being upset about the retreat, but decidedly sober. There was no indication when he came home Friday that he was on drugs. Frank never told his family about the LSD. However, he had told Alice that he suspected the US had used biological weapons in Korea and that he was upset about it. Frank also tells Alice that he plans to quit his job, and on Monday he meets his boss, Vin Rouet, and tells him he'd like to leave the biowarfare program. Rouet says that Frank Olson believed he'd somehow messed up the experiment at the retreat. Rouet assured him there was no problem, and Olson agreed to continue working. Eric contends that at this point, Frank Olson knew he wanted to leave the program, but that since he held classified information and his colleagues saw him as a possible whistleblower, he knew that just quitting wasn't an option. They wouldn't let him just hand in his 2 weeks and go.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point when talking about these things, because when you work in a top secret capacity, you're exposed to all sorts of government information. And so it's not like a 9-to-5 job where you could just be like, all right, I'm retiring, or all right, I'm leaving. Once you're in, you're very much entrapped in.
Yeah, we can see as well, too, that someone like Edward Snowden had to flee to Moscow.
Yeah, that was like between what happened to Edward Snowden and what happened to Chelsea Manning, you could see that the intelligence community doesn't fuck around when it senses what it considers a traitor.
Right. Vin Rouet claims that Frank Olson was still acting erratically days after the LSD should have worn off. So Rouet brought him to Sidney Gottlieb's office. Gottlieb insists that the men bring Frank Olson to New York City to receive treatment from Dr. Harold Alexander Abramson, the physician most closely tied with Project MKUltra. Dr. Abramson wasn't a psychiatrist or a neurologist, he was an allergist. Frank Olson knew Dr. Abramson from their work during the Korean War. As Eric Olson notes, allergists, like Frank Olson himself, are concerned with how particles are distributed in the air. Why Frank Olson needs to see an allergist in New York rather than a psychiatrist in Greater DC is perhaps a matter of security clearance. However, I think it's odd that people so concerned with getting him help would take him to a different city to see someone with a separate medical specialty. Tuesday, around midday, Frank Olson abruptly returns home from work to tell Alice that he's going to New York to receive psychiatric treatment. He and Vinrouette promised her that Frank would be home for Thanksgiving on Thursday. As we know, that wouldn't happen. Eric describes his father's death as more of a disappearance. He was there with them on Tuesday and then left the city, and they never saw him alive again. That must be awful to try and understand as a child.
I could see why Eric ends up being very, I don't want to say obsessed, because there's a lot of negative connotations with that particular word, but focused, shall we say, on trying to unravel this case and hold people accountable. Because, yeah, I could see that it would be very traumatic for a child to experience.
Yeah, there's no closure.
Yeah, exactly.
After a meeting with Dr. Abramson, the men indeed returned to Washington, D.C. on Thursday, but then, citing Frank Olson's erratic behavior, turn around and go back to New York. This time, however, Vinrouette stays in D.C., while Olson, along with Robert Lashbrook, return to New York. Eric believes this provides an escape for Vinrouette. As Olson's boss and a friend of the family, he can't be around if they're going to assassinate Frank Olson. Dr. Abramson gives Olson some strange treatments, including a bottle of bourbon and several tablets of the barbiturate Nembutal, which, as Stephen Kinzer points out, should not be mixed with alcohol. Some Reddit conspiracy theorists think Abramson might have been continually drugging Frank Olson to keep him crazy. I'm not really sure why he would do that, but he definitely doesn't seem to be helping the guy.
I mean, if there were fears within the intelligence community that Frank Olson would flip and reveal classified information or go public or something, maybe continuously drugging him and maintaining his so-called crazy behavior or like keeping him behaving erratically is a way to like preemptively destroy his legitimacy.
That's definitely a theory, yeah. Abramson encouraged Olson to voluntarily check into a Maryland sanatorium called Chestnut Lodge, and Olson agreed that he would. At another point, some reports indicate that the men took Frank to see a magician called John Mulholland. Mulholland wrote a CIA manual on misdirection, meaning he was a friend of the program and that they had an interest in his work as a professional distractor. But why would they take Frank Olson to see a magician, especially if he appeared to be in some sort of constant bad trip? That seems like a horrible idea.
This reminds me of the Watchmen joke in the comic that's like a guy goes to a doctor, tells him that I have depression, etc., etc. And the doctor's like, treatment is simple. Go see the clown Pagliacci. He's in town and he's really good. The patient replies, but doctor, I am Pagliacci.
Oh. Eric has doubts about whether they actually did meet with Mulholland or if this is just something that like randomly appears in one of the reports, which again is super sketchy because if you asked me what I did this weekend, I could tell you, like every place that I went and who I saw. People who have critically examined this case have acknowledged that the timeline, documents, physical evidence, testimonies from the other agents, etc. just don't add up. So we have to view a lot of this speculatively. Friday evening, the men have a few drinks in the bar at the Statler Hotel before retiring to their rooms. Frank Olson shared a room with Robert Lashbrook. Why? Certainly the CIA has the money to give each of these men their own hotel room. So was Lashbrook there to support Olson and make sure he didn't try to hurt himself? Or was he more of a security detail?
Or maybe they were having an affair. Sorry, just kidding.
That's a theory that the police came up with, the NYPD.
Seriously?
Yeah. A lover's quarrel gone wrong.
Yes. When I get angry at my lover, I throw them out of a double-pane, very strong glass window.
Olson and Lashbrook stayed in room 1018A, 13 stories above the sidewalk. The Statler had a policy of keeping lodgers with possible psychiatric disturbances on lower floors, specifically so they couldn't try to jump. But nobody alerted the hotel that Frank Olson was going through something or asked for a room on a lower floor. Early Saturday morning, around 2:30 a.m. on November 28, 1953, Dr. Frank Olson plummets from room 1018A to the pavement in front of the Statler Hotel. The night manager, Armand Pastor, rushed out to see what has happened. Frank Olson is still alive, but barely. He lifts his head and tries to say something to Pastor, but dies before Pastor can make out any words. Pastor looks up and sees that Olson fell from room 1018A and goes back into the hotel. He asked the switchboard operator if anyone made any outgoing calls from that room, probably trying to see if Frank had killed himself and maybe called his family to say goodbye. The switchboard operator says that someone did, in fact, make an outgoing call. The interaction was so brief that the operator heard the whole thing, as back then the operator had to listen with a headset and literally connect wires on the board to route calls. According to the switchboard operator, the first speaker said, "Well, he's gone." And the second replied, "That's too bad," before hanging up the phone. We now know that the first speaker was Robert Lashbrook inside room 1018A, and the second was Dr. Abramson. Eric Olson reads this as an indication that Frank Olson's death was planned, and that the call was confirmation that this had happened.
I'm torn between this being proof of an actual murder or just, him actually jumping out and this was a reflection of their general indifference to it.
It's definitely so creepy.
Oh yeah, there's like alarm bells ringing.
The NYPD went up to room 1018A to find Robert Lashbrook sitting on the toilet. According to Lashbrook, he woke up when he heard the glass break, and Olson was gone. The police took Lashbrook to the 14th Precinct station. Lashbrook told them that Olson was an army bacteriologist suffering a mental health crisis, and that he must have jumped through the window. Lashbrook also said that the ordeal must be kept quiet as a matter of national security. Now, I can just imagine the NYPD eating this up. A CIA agent tells them they're in on some sort of secret case, and they're so eager to please the spy cops that they just go along with it.
Oh, absolutely. I think I have this theory or like this observation that American cops in particular have this pathology of pretending that if it wasn't for some make-believe hamstring injury that they got while throwing the game-winning touchdown in high school football, they'd now be tier 1 operators in the Navy SEALs or Green Berets or whatever. So, not being that, if they see someone come in and flash a badge and tell them they're part of a top secret operation, Project Q classified operation, they'd probably kill their own families if the guy asked them to.
At this point, according to Stephen Kinzer, the CIA fixers came in and began cleaning the hotel room and crafting a cover story. Armand Pastor was haunted by that night. So much didn't make sense to him. First, who jumps out a closed window? He never saw that before or after Frank Olson. The short phone call reported by the switchboard operator is also disturbing. Even if Olson jumped, there's just no reaction from Lashbrook. Lashbrook's complete nonchalance about the whole thing, like sitting on the toilet when the police arrive, strikes me as incredibly strange. I know I'm a mere civilian, but I would be flipping out if my hotel roommate and colleague crashed through the window. I definitely would have run down as fast as my legs could take me and see if by some miracle they were still alive.
Also, my first phone call would be to 911, not to some random guy who says, "Oh, that's too bad."
Yeah. So, since this episode has peeked around so many corners, we're going to have to extend it into a 2-parter, so please tune in next week to hear about how Dr. Frank Olson's death came to the public's attention and what theories have arisen around the case.
Dun dun dun!
We hate to leave you on such a cliffhanger, but hopefully we've given you a lot to ponder for the next week. If you're curious about the nefarious and sometimes bungled activities of the CIA, please find us on Patreon because our bonus episode this month is going to be about the failed assassination attempts on Fidel Castro. I wouldn't use the word fun to describe it, but he lived, so it'll be a fun episode.
I mean, if this episode makes you afraid of the CIA and their terrifying capabilities, the Fidel Castro episode will make you realize how they can also basically be a bunch of Mr. Beans.
Yeah. Well, if you do like our content, like we said, you can find us on patreon.com/DasCriminal. It's always in the description. We are on Instagram at DasCriminalPod. We post photos and stuff about our cases. Please, guys, rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast, especially if you give us a 5-star review and leave a nice comment. It really helps boost us in the algorithm.
It also makes us feel nice, which is, kind thing to do.
Yeah, that is true. Thank you guys for listening. Like we said, come back next week. We will talk in more detail about the theories behind the case and our own thoughts.
Yeah, take care, everyone. Hope you have a lovely week ahead of you. and see you next time.
Bye.